Hello everybody, Sparkster1701 here, and today we're going to take a look at somebody I probably should have looked at a long time ago. Many months ago I did a review on the Decepticon Communications Officer Soundwave, so now, after a long and, for whatever reason, hiatus that I've caused for it, we're going to take a look at the Autobot Communications Officer, Blaster. Now, Blaster was released in 1985, the year after Soundwave came out. He would also be available in 1986. He would be discontinued in 1987, and we would not get a replacement for him until he resurfaced again in 1990 as an Action Master. That doesn't want to stand up. Now, while nobody took over Blaster's function, Blaster would get supplemented in his function in 1986 with Hubcap. In the Japanese toy line, Blaster would be killed in a battle with Soundwave, and like Soundwave, he would come back in a reformatted mode as Twincast. In addition, Blaster is one of 3 Transformers that shares his name with a GoBot. This is GoBot Blaster. Feel free to laugh at the size difference. When I did this speech at MatsuriCon and showed a picture of the two of them together, they laughed too. But also in the sense, the GoBots also repainted their Blaster into this green color to match his cartoon appearance. Blaster is also the name of a character from the 80s TV series Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future, in which case that Blaster was a very evil robot that was constantly being destroyed throughout various episodes of the series until finally being destroyed at the end of the first season. Blaster is also the generic term used in Star Wars to describe their handguns. Like Soundwave before him, Blaster is capable of storing any of the mini cassettes right here into his chest cavity. The problem is that through general wear and tear, or possibly from a rather poor design, the cassette door and the buttons that operate it tend to wear out over time, and thus rendering it unusable. So if you find a Blaster that somebody's asking an incredible amount of money for, that's probably why, is the fact that the tape door still works on it. Otherwise, Blaster can be found relatively cheaply, but he does have his frailties, like namely the antenna here on the top of his head. Those are of thin plastic, and they can be broken very easily. As my brother has gone through about 3 Blasters trying to find one with a decent door, and at least one of them had a broken antenna there, so something to keep an eye on for, folks. Unfortunately, this was the 3rd attempt, and still no working tape door, so he's kind of given up on it. And I don't blame him. Let's take a look at Blaster's articulation, and he has a fair good amount of articulation for a Transformer. You can turn his head from side to side. He does have a joint at his shoulder, so you can rotate his arms all the way around. He does have a joint here at the hip for his legs, and a slight one at the knee, but it allows him more to bend to the side. But that does allow you to have him look like he's doing some decent sidekicks. Unfortunately, with the feet being on very thin, and rather thin plastic, he can't stand that way without falling flat on his face. We won't show you that. That's too embarrassing. That, and I'm worried about my hands. One other quick point of articulation is that his arms can be rotated here at the shoulders. A lot of people think that that's how his arms are supposed to be, but then he's not holding his gun properly. He's holding the gun sideways, and with the weight of the gun, it kind of ends up aiming lower. All around in general, that looks kind of stupid, folks, so let's put it back. Now, we'll take this time, we'll transform Blaster. Start by removing his gun. Carefully set that aside, we'll explain that later. And now, to transform Blaster, we start by turning his head all the way around, and then you will fold it down into the body. Then next, we're going to take his arms. We'll slide the fists inside. You can do that by forcing them in, or you can use the tabs on the sides. It's easier just to push them in. Then slide his forearms up all the way until they snap into place. And then push the arms so they're flush against the body. And next, we'll come down here. We fold his feet into the legs. You also reach into the side of the legs and fold out the carry handles. And then we take each leg, fold it up against the sides of his body, like so. Then the lower legs just fold up so that they meet at the top. You merge the carry handle together and slide the black piece over to lock it into place. And there we have it, folks. Blaster is a miniature boombox. Although some people tend to want to refer to him as a ghetto blaster. And I'm kind of against that, due to the fact he's pretty small to really be called a ghetto blaster. Most of those tend to be of a bit larger size, so that they have bigger speakers so they can really pump out the sounds. And you look at him from the side there, he's not really all that big, so calling him that is a little bit of a stretch. Plus, I also find the term a little bit on the derogatory side. Plus, also, being a fan of 007, when I hear Ghetto Blaster, I tend to think of the weapon that Q Branch was experimenting with for the Americans in the movie The Living Daylights, where they modified a boombox to also be a rocket launcher. Now there's a ghetto blaster. But at any rate, Blaster happened to come out during the formative years of the hard rock and roll that was prominent in the 1980s. So a lot of the bands at that time, or performers, were probably being pumped out of the speakers. What do you think, fans? Think Blaster was pumping out, what, some AC/DC? Aerosmith? Whitesnake? Sound off in the comments below. Whose music do you think Blaster was pumping out of those speakers? One last thing to point out about this toy in particular is the American version here of Blaster is modified from his original Diaclone toy, in the fact that the original toy was a fully working AM radio. So these speakers on here were not just for looks, nor was the on and off switch over here. These weren't for looks. They worked on the original toy. Somehow, with the fact that he has been more neutered than most other Transformers, that seems kind of a disappointment. Now we'll take a look at Blaster's loose parts, and unlike his Decepticon counterpart, who had quite a few pieces, Blaster only has one. This gun, or as his instructions call it, an Electro Scrambler gun. It's an interesting weapon of sorts. I mean, you got a pretty nice long gun barrel with a little sight here on the end of it. He's got a rather impressive looking scope here on the top. If you didn't know any better, you'd almost say that Blaster was a sniper instead of a communications officer. And it's got a pretty decent stock here on the end of it. Now, a lot of people are probably wondering, what is the deal with this big hole in the middle of it? Well, as I stated earlier, the Japanese version, when the toy originally came out, was a working radio. These holes here would be where you would store your earbuds. So that explains the hole in it. Now, surprisingly, this gun is very difficult to find on the secondary market. One would think, it's such a big gun, how do you lose it so easily? Well, the most common excuse is that the kids that owned this toy back in the 80s probably didn't keep the weapons with the toy as easily, and when they didn't come by and collect it, Mom probably either threw it out or sold the toy in a garage sale, and this would wind up in the garbage. To all of you out there who've heard this story before, yes, it's always Mom's fault. It's never ours, it's Mom's. Good luck convincing her of that. If she's anything like my mother, it ain't gonna work. But another thing to point out, and this was an accidental discovery on my brother's part with this, is the fact that this gun is made of very hard plastic. So it does tend to break very easily. I myself have put this gun back together twice. I mean, I'd show you where the crack is on it, but I'd rather not. Because I don't want to take a chance that I'm likely going to break this thing, and I'm not relishing a third repair on it. In most cases, this gun by itself sells for just about as much as you can buy a complete blaster. So, good luck on finding this, my friends, and I recommend you do everything you can to take special care when you store this gun. This is kind of like the original G.I. Joe toys that were being sold at the same time the Transformers came out. Many of them in the early run had accessories made of hard plastic, and they would easily break, or they would break the thumbs off of their figures due to the way they were made, and forced Hasbro to make softer ones. But I don't believe they ended up making a soft plastic version of this gun, so take great care when you get one. Before we get too much further into this, folks, I want to make a quick correction here on Blaster. Since I originally said about his arms, yes, the hands do rotate independently, so he does have a joint here at his wrists. So his arms are supposed to be put where the stickers point out here on the sides, and his hands can be rotated so he can hold his weapon properly. He just doesn't have a good center of balance when he's like that. So we'll make a couple of adjustments here and show that off. I do apologize for that. Because we'll scoot him to the side here and See, Twincast does the same thing too. So this is the correct way to have him, not the earlier way. This is the right way now. All right, I do apologize for that, folks. That does tend to happen here. All right, now moving on to a quick comparison. As you know, Blaster was put out in '85. Soundwave came out the year before in 1984. Now, of course, when Soundwave came out, Soundwave had minions. He came with Buzzsaw, and you could also get Laserbeak. You could get Ravage. Ravage will stand for us here. Or he'll just lean over there. Who cares? You also had Rumble. And you had Frenzy. So, Soundwave had minions. Blaster, he didn't have anybody. Now, I know some of you are out there saying, yes, he did. I remember the scene in the movie. He had minions. Yes, Blaster did have minions. But his minions didn't come out until 1986. A year later, Blaster would get Steeljaw. And Rewind. And Eject. And Ramhorn. But Blaster had to wait a whole year, and he only got 4 guys. Of course, in 1986, Soundwave gained another guy and got Ratbat, so he still led the pack in terms of cassette minions. Soundwave would eventually wind up with a grand total of 10 in the United States. Blaster would only get 6. But many more were available in the Japanese line. Why they didn't get brought over here is anybody's guess. Front and center. Maybe off center. Now we'll take a look at Blaster's instructions. Now, these are done in the style that was new in 1985, where they were predominantly black and white, but they'd have colors to indicate their faction. In this case, he was red, so he was an Autobot. You can see here, they list Blaster as a radio. Note, will hold all Transformers mini cassettes, but does not operate as radio or cassette player. Nice of them to point that out. It's probably on the box, too. And then we go into how to transform him. As you saw earlier, Blaster is pretty simple to transform. Coming around here to the back side. Blaster here shares one characteristic alongside Shockwave, who was reviewed a couple of weeks ago, in the fact that Shockwave did not come with stickers, neither did Blaster. They were already on. But a difference here on the last page is that Blaster had the mark for the authenticity for his rub sign, whereas 2 weeks ago, Shockwave, I did state, possibly came in '84. His instructions sort of reflect that, as they don't have this addition for the rub sign, which, as you can see, is on Blaster's groin, so we will not go there. A notice here to collect and save the robot points for promotions, and read the tech specs. Speaking of which, and again mentioning Shockwave, not only do I have the American tech spec right here, but we also, like for Shockwave before, we have a European version of him, and while I'm not very fluent in any of these languages, I used to be pretty decent at Spanish, but I've gotten pretty rusty over the years. I like the fact that it adds notice on the specs that the radio and cassette player functions do not work. And also, like on Shockwave, there are no numbers on the sides here, so reading the grid is kind of useless. But we'll take a look at Blaster here. It has a nice picture of him that would have been on the front of the box. It's all done in red to indicate he's an Autobot, and it even says Autobot. It gives his name as Blaster, and his function is communications. His motto is, when the music is rockin', I'm rollin'. Finds all Earth music interesting, but it's rock and roll, good, hard, and loud, that really sparks his circuits. In the forefront of any situation he's involved in. As AM/FM stereo cassette player, he can perform as DEC plus receive radio signals of all frequencies with power outputs as low as 1/1,000,000th watt. Acts as Autobot Communications Center. Can transmit up to 4,000 miles. Carries electro scrambler gun that disrupts electrical devices. So in some ways here, his gun sounds pretty similar to the ion guns that the Jawas used to capture R2-D2 in the original Star Wars movie. So, kind of an interesting thing. Let's see if he can blast any Decepticons, see if they fall down flat. Moving right along here, we'll lay the decoder over the grid and take a look at Blaster's tech specs. It gives his strength and his intelligence as 8, his speed is 2, his endurance is 8, his rank is 7, his courage is 9, his firepower is 7, and his skill is 9. So, aside from his weakness, aside from his low speed, Blaster here is a relatively powerful Autobot. Now we get down to, what do I think of him? Unfortunately, Blaster's not going to come through this one very good, folks. Hear me out before you start posting hate messages. Blaster in the cartoon was done up more or less to be similar to Jazz. They enjoyed having a good time, and they enjoyed Earth's music. Unfortunately, the cartoon really didn't do much to differentiate between the two, so in a lot of ways, they kind of were almost the same character with how they were presented in the cartoon. According to the More Than Meets the Eye guidebooks, they'd further develop Blaster to be somebody that is also often insubordinate and more open to questioning the orders that he's been given. And granted, while most militaries do have people that like to push their insubordination or buck authority, those characters eventually tend to wear out their welcome. And in a lot of cases, I believe that also hurts Blaster in some senses, due to the fact that if you're going to openly question anything you don't agree with, you're not going to be reliable to the higher command, and they're going to be less willing to use you and be more open to finding somebody else that will do your job and follow orders. As a toy, Blaster was okay until I found the information regarding how the original Japanese toy was, and then seeing what we got here in America is a major disappointment. I mean, yeah, granted, right here in America, more often than not, most AM frequencies are usually reserved for a lot of the talk radio. So you might predominantly get news or political talk shows or Rush Limbaugh. But would it have really costed Hasbro all that much to have modified him to pick up FM signals where he could pick up more music and be more reminiscent of how he appeared in the cartoon? Because we do know a few times within the cartoon when he was hanging out with their Earth buddies, he was usually picking up the music and playing it wherever he could. So I think Hasbro lost out a little bit on the opportunity. I mean, granted, it was more a money scheme, more of a money decision to neuter him so he wouldn't be as expensive to sell here in America, but I still think that was a lost opportunity for them. I was going to use that as enough of an excuse to put Blaster at the bottom tier, but there are a few redeeming qualities for Blaster, and given the fact that he, like Soundwave, even though they were taken out of the market relatively early in the line, were still relevant throughout the line as more cassette guys were made. I think I'm going to put Blaster into the middle tier, but he's still going to be kind of hanging towards the bottom end of that. Because while the added minions do help to keep him relevant, the way the toy was neutered for the American release and his portrayals just doesn't really work out for me. And that was my review of the 1985 Autobot Communications Officer Blaster. If you liked the video, please thumbs up it here on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't already. Like this video, share your comments and post down below and help support and keep this channel going. This is Sparkster1701 saying I'll catch you all later. Okay guys, review's over. Let's get down and jam!